All right, we're going.
Welcome to the Breaking Into Athletic Performance podcast. I'm Christian Chofi here with Ryan Smack, and we're doing another one of our short little clips here. This time we're going to talk about off-season versus in-season training. So the first topic we're going to dive into is volume and intensity for off-season or in-season training. So the volume when you're in the off-season is going to be much higher because athletes are not practicing. The intensity can be higher in the off season, but generally it's going to be lower because if your volume is very high, your intensity cannot be high as well because you will destroy your athletes very quickly that way. In terms of specifics, I like to focus on local muscular endurance early in the off season, hypertrophy as well early in the off season, and then start building a strength base. Then when we get closer to the season, maybe like a mini peak, and we start working on power and speed a little bit more in the weight room, that is. And then when we get into the season, it really depends on which sport you have. So if you have a team sport, you're going to be managing them a little bit more than if you have a sport that is focusing on one peak at the end of the year, such as track or a tournament sport like wrestling or tennis, swim and dive. So that's where the difference comes in a little bit. Those sports, you're going to be pretty much grinding through the season, and your intensity your volume can be a little bit higher until you get down to that last couple of weeks of the season when they're going into the postseason. And then you're going to be working on peaking real high intensity. And that doesn't mean high load. That just means high intensity. So you might be working on fast moving stuff, or you may be working on some max strength things. High CNS load, but your volume is going to be extremely low. When you're talking about a skill sport, it's going to be more level throughout the season because teams generally need to win games to get into their conference tournament, which can still go on for a long time. And then you have NCAAs if they make it that far. So your volume and intensity are going to be more level with skill sports or team sports. But at the end of the day, it depends how you program, but you are working little mini peaks in there as well for like important conference games, or just so you take some time off, not necessarily time, but drop the load, linear periodization and letting them recover there. That's about all I have for volume and intensity. What have you got?
I agree with everything you said. One thing I want to add into there is obviously when you're in the off season, your volume is going to be higher, but just because you're starting the off season doesn't mean the volume should necessarily start higher than it was in season. Because typically, you come off a season, you're going to be pretty beat up. You're going to be really fatigued. And at the end of the season is when your weight room specific volume would be the lowest. So you need to take that into consideration when you start the first week or really the first cycle of training in your off season, so you can slowly accumulate back into that volume and slowly increase your training density to where they're not going to be totally shot into the ground because they haven't done anything remotely similar to that type of stuff in a long time. This is going to bridge a little bit into our next topic, but one thing that I like to do when it comes to volume and intensity for in-season versus off-season is my off-season volume and intensity will typically be a lot more tissue-based. So I'm trying to chase tissue adaptation, whether it's hypertrophy or, like you said, local muscular endurance or stabilization and motor control, which is not tissue, it's neural. But it's going to be a lot more high repetition and high volume based, where in season, I'm trying to chase neural adaptation. So that's where that intensity comes in, where a lot of people are trying to maintain in season, which I think is not a super efficient way of looking at things, because usually, especially like at my level in D2, more than 50% of our training time in the year is in season. So we still need to try to improve in season, even in those team sports. And I personally think the way that you're able to do that is by chasing neural adaptations, whether it's increasing your strength levels, increasing your power, your speed, and just everything like that. So those things can still increase as long as you are smart with the timing of the training session in relation to when they need to compete. Something that kind of goes along with that will allow you to modify the tissue stress and the overall stress on the athlete in a way that it doesn't interfere with their competition would be exercise choice. In the off season, you're obviously going to be able to pick exercises that might cause a lot more muscle soreness. So, your extended eccentrics. I know that's not an exercise choice, but it's a variable that you manipulate within your exercises that are going to cause a lot more muscle soreness. Anything that's going to increase time under tension. And typically, you'll try to load the athletes through a much larger range of motion when you're in the off season than you would in the in season. Just a quick example to highlight what I mean by that is if you are working with an offensive tackle for a football team, in the off season, they're not constantly using their hands and their wrists and their shoulders trying to block a defensive lineman, and they're not constantly getting all that impact in their shoulder and their wrist and their hand. So a normal range of motion bench press without a board is obviously fine as long as they don't have any limitations. But once you're in season and that volume of contact and stress to those joints increases, you might put a board in there to decrease their stress, or you might add chains or bands so the top of the range of motion where the stronger part is still stressed with more load, where the bottom part, which is the weaker part and usually the higher risk part of the motion, you might want to try to decrease stress, which will also go a long way towards decreasing the mechanical stress on the muscle, the time under tension, and the potential soreness that you're going to get that might interfere with practice or games. Usually you're going to want to pick exercises that, like I said, I personally would use a high neural stimulus. So I typically stay away from exercises where you need to have a lot of volume in order for them to be effective. I'm not going to use a push-up, for example, with a team that typically has high upper body strength where if they're not loading the push-up, they need to do sets of 20 to 25 reps in order to get a training stimulus from it. I'll probably pick either a dumbbell bench or a bench press or something that's able to be loaded so you're able to get a high neural stimulus with very low volume and still get an adaptation. You're also probably going to eliminate a lot of your unnecessary assistance work for that period. So what I mean by that is if you're training a soccer team and they travel 4.5 miles in practice the day before, and you see that on a GPS unit, you might want to stay away from some of your hamstring exercises or some of your posterior chain volume. And even if you don't cut those out, you need to decrease the volume on those just to adapt to whatever's going on at practice. That's kind of all I have for exercise choice. If you have anything you want to add to that, I'd love to hear it.
Yeah, the only thing I would say wouldn't really be an addition, but when you talk about things that are going to be less fatiguing, I would be on the side of using more double leg, double arm exercises in season as opposed to single. Your volume is technically going to be the same on each arm, no matter if you're choosing single or double, but your neural fatigue might be a little different with a single leg exercise because you're doing more total reps. You're not doing more on each side. You're doing the same on each side if you're picking the same rep scheme, but your neural fatigue might be lower because you're doing more total. I don't know what I would call it. More total reps, yes, but more total efforts is the word I was trying to look for.
Yeah, that's a good way to put that.
But yeah, that's pretty much what I got too. So our next topic would be conditioning. And this is definitely the easiest topic to talk about, and we already have before, because in season, you're really not doing any conditioning. So that's really easy to hit on. But the one thing I would say is, so if you have a sport like track or swimming, for example, their whole sports conditioning, you don't need to do any of that really anyway, because that's what their sport coaches are paid for. But in the off season, you might be doing a little extra with them. It depends on your team. So we'll focus on skill sports in the off season. But one thing you might do with sports that are like a tournament sports, like wrestling or tennis in season, you got to maintain their speed. They might not always get up to top speed in practice. I mean, wrestlers definitely will not. So it's important maybe in the warm up to hit that stimulus if you can with sports like that. So just like 2 or 3. I think I talked about this before. 2 or 3 quick. You can even do acceleration, 10, 20, 30 yards. If you want to get up to top speed, go 40, 50. That's up to you. It depends how your athletes are and what you're able to do with them. But that's pretty much it for in-season, really simple. For off-season, we've already talked about energy system development, so I'm not going to go too far into it. But like we said before, you're starting out building an aerobic base, and then you're moving into your glycolytic and ATP-PC system development when you get closer to the season. Yeah, I don't know. Is there anything else I should touch on there?
No, I mean, I agree with your points. One thing to take into consideration is the people that are on like the 1 or 2 deep squad in season versus the people who don't get much action in the games.
Yeah.
So like especially let's say basketball, if you play 2 games a week, the time on feet and the high intensity efforts and just the conditioning demand on the people who are in the, let's say, the 1 through 7 rotation is so much higher than maybe the back 5 to 6 to 7 guys that don't go in. So planning for worst case scenario, just like we talked about in our energy system episode, it might be worth trying to do a little bit extra conditioning with those guys, especially in a sport where the game frequency is high. But you need to also think about the fact that they are still practicing whenever the rest of the team is. So you don't want to overkill it. Something that I like to do for that is off-feet conditioning. So I'll do like bike intervals or airdyne sprints or something on the rower, just so they're able to take some stress off their joints, but they're still getting like a conditioning effect within whatever energy system you're trying to target. And it's usually not as stressful to their body, but they're still getting that extra conditioning effect that they're not getting when they're playing in the games. Do you have any comments specifically about that or anything you like to do to target situations?
I mean, just first, that's why this GPS technology is so important and so useful if you have access to it. Because, I mean, I doubt there's a lot of people, but there might be some old-time coaches out there that are just like, I don't want to deal with this technology. And that's fine. They probably have developed really good coaching eyes at this point in their career. But at the same time, that objective data is so important to see which kids exactly have been getting a lower stimulus once you get into the season, that if you can just have them do a couple sprints or a couple push-ups after the game, literally anything, because their volume is so low. It depends on their sport, what you're going to do with them. But if they're not getting, I mean, they're going to be detraining if they're not getting the same stimulus as the starters or close to it. So that stuff's really important. Other than that, I don't really have anything else.
Yeah, I mean, I think that takes care of most of it. Our last topic would be, for this specific episode, would be maintaining a flexible schedule. Obviously, when you're in the off season, the practice duration and the practice frequency is so much lower than in the in season. In some cases, they might not even be practicing yet, depending on the time of year. So when you're in the off season, you have a lot more control over what it is they're doing with their body, at least in terms of organized activity. In those situations, you'll probably have a little bit more of a set schedule, and it will be a little bit easier to plan ahead and actually work back from a specific date that you have in mind where you want to hit maybe a certain volume benchmark or a test day or something like that, and you can actually plan for it. When you're in season, even if there's a set practice schedule, that clearly takes priority over the weight room schedule. In certain instances, you might have to train after practice with the team every single time you see them. So you need to adjust your training plan based on the fact that they're going to be coming after practice and they're fatigued. You might think, okay, I'm going to have 45 minutes to train them 3 times a week after practice. Day one that you're supposed to train them, maybe they get held in practice long because someone's getting punished or they're trying to implement a new scheme or something like that, and you don't see them at all. You obviously need to adjust your other 2 days in a smart way that doesn't interfere with whatever game might come on the tail end of that. You might only see them for 20 minutes. They might come late because they had to do some extra running, or the coach organized a practice that really killed them and their legs are dead tired, and you planned on trying to get your lower body strength stimulus in that day. But you can't necessarily do that if they just ran the hell out of the athletes at practice. So it's very important to have, okay, this would be my best case scenario plan for the week or for the month or however long you want to plan ahead. And then you definitely need a plan B. And then you probably want to have at least ideas in your head of what you would do if certain circumstances happen. In my experience, you usually don't know what those circumstances are until they happen. But once they do, you better make sure you have an idea of what you're going to do next time it happens, because most sport coaches kind of have habits that they fall into, whether they mean to or not. So if you work with a coach who constantly keeps the team late, you need to plan for that. If you work with a coach that constantly runs the hell out of the team and that's their way of punishing the team for missing class or something, you need to know that, and you need to communicate with the kids and communicate with the coach so that you're able to plan around things that are not necessarily on the scripted paper, because like we all know, that's not exactly how a sport practice goes. It's usually a starting point, and then it will differentiate a lot from day to day from that original script.
Yeah, those are all good points. One thing I would add is a specific thing that I do is I make a mental note of each block on that workout card. So let's say I have my first block is 2 exercises, next block's 2 or 3, next block's 2 or 3, next block's 2 or 3. I have it in my mind which 2 or 3 I'm going to pick if they're crushed or if we're short for time. So I'm not guessing that when they get in there. So if they get in half hour late, I'm going to say, all right, we're doing sets A and B or whatever. Or if we have a ton of time, say we're doing the whole lift card. So it's always important to have that contingency plan and make sure that the athletes are aware that that's how you're going to run it. If they come in late, or if they come in and say they're absolutely abolished, you're just going to do your last 2, which are usually low intensity. For me, it's light core work or assistance work or injury prevention stuff. So that's usually how I line up my workouts. In terms of some other things, one thing I would do is don't be afraid to add that stuff in if you can get out to practice and have those guys doing their clamshells and stuff in between when they're getting water or whatever. And you got to talk to your coach, but that's always an option if you have the time. And that's something I like to do. And it spreads out your overall stress from the weight room if you can figure that stuff out.
Yeah, those are all good ideas. One thing I just want to add to this whole working around the practice schedule idea is last time we talked about monitoring. I think in season is where RPE scores for both practice and the weight room sessions are super important. That'll allow you to get a gauge of how the athletes view the stress level of practice and the stress level of what you're doing. In addition to that, I think especially with the practices going on in season, if you're able to get some sort of soreness map, whether it's in an actual app that the athletes may have access to, or it's just before the lift starts when they're all coming in, you just say, hey, how do you feel? What's sore? If you constantly hear them saying one area is sore, and let's say their hamstrings are super sore and you planned on doing 4 sets of single leg RDLs, you might not need to take the single leg RDL out of there, but you might want to adjust the load and the volume and maybe even the way that they're loading it with a med ball versus a barbell or something like that if everyone is super sore in one area. So I think communication with the athletes is super, super important for the in-season flexibility. Their view on practice and what's going on and how they feel about it is going to be very different than the coach. Usually the coach doesn't realize that they're killing the athletes in this one specific physical area and it's really draining them. But if you talk to the athletes, like I said, if you hear a common answer from a lot of people and you know the athletes and you kind of ask the ones that you can trust and you know are the hard workers, you'll usually get a lot of really good information that will allow you to kind of adjust your schedule based on what the athletes are feeling and saying about things.
Yeah, for sure. And the best thing you can do is if it's an option, participate in practice. Like track, if I can, I try to participate in every event if I have that team, at least one practice, so I know what they're feeling when they come into the weight room. If it's a sport you've never played before, like a skill sport you've never done, it's going to be tough. But, I mean, you can always get out on the track. You might be able to get in the pool if you're a decent swimmer. The other sports are obviously going to be tough, but, I mean, and that's going to do wonders for you both with your coaches and your athletes. So that's something I always try to do. I'll go out and shag fly balls at softball practice or baseball practice. It's going to be a good option no matter who your coaches are. But that's all I got. You got anything else?
No, like you said, this was a pretty quick one. I think there's a lot of information out there about what other people do that are very, very good at their jobs in terms of in-season loading. So if anyone has any questions or they want to talk about it with us, just like always reach out. If anyone has any good resources too, and they think they see something interesting, feel free to send it our way because you can never have enough learning material. So, yeah.
Sure. Yeah, I'd say the same. Please don't hesitate to reach out for anything. And thanks for tuning in.
Yep. Thank you.